Welcome to the Indian Gaming Association's The New Normal webcast. My name is Lisa Johnson. I'm the conference manager for the Indian Gaming Trade Show and Convention. I'd like to share a few housekeeping tips before we get started. Everyone is muted by default except for our speakers. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box and they'll be brought up at the end. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Victor Rocha, conference chairman of the Indian Gaming Association.
Good morning, everyone. I knew he was going to get it at the last second. Welcome to the new normal, your go-to source for insightful discussions on the gaming industry and the critical issues impacting Native American tribes across the United States. I'm Victor Rocha, and joining me is my co-host Jason Giles, probably going to get coffee, Executive Director of Indian Gaming Association. Today, we're taking a closer look at one of the most immediate threats facing tribal and regulated gaming prediction markets. Um, but Joining us to break down these very complex, urgent issues are three of the most important and respected legal minds in tribal and federal gaming law. Brian Newland, former Assistant Secretary of the Interior and now Principal at Powers, Piles, Sutter, and Verville, right? Verville? Scott Crowell, our dear friend, founder of Crowell Law Office's Tribal Advocacy Group, a dear friend, and a other good friend. I know it sounds like a backslapping thing, but these are people I admire and are my friends. Joe Webster, managing partner at Hobbs Strauss Dean Walker. Gentlemen, welcome everybody. And Jason, welcome. You're looking good. I forgot, we did this thing and it's Legislative Hill Week. So Jason is running around on the Hill doing his job, meeting everyone. So he's right in the middle of the action. He's no pedestrian sitting in the side in the stands of the peanut gallery. The man is on the Hill. How you doing,
All right.
Jason?
I apologize for wearing a suit and tie. We try to keep it casual, and now we're going to set expectations. And I can't meet those every week when I'm rushing out to grab the kids after this or go to some game. But
Yeah, don't we
otherwise,
all?
yeah, we're here with a lot of tribal leaders in town. Lots going on in DC, and I think I'll just start, guys, because it's of important interest to everybody on this call and our guests, of course. But we had a morning meeting with Senator Grassley, who is on the Agricultural Committee, which oversees the CFTC. And probably to nobody's surprise, neither he nor his staff knew anything about this, but they instantly understood that, commodities, which is in the title of the act and of the commission, does not involve sports betting. And as we'll explore today, we're starting to see more so-called futures contracts being put out there on whether a volcano will erupt in Alaska, on whether the no tax on tips will pass in Trump's one big beautiful bill. So if you can imagine taking a futures contract out on something as obscure as whether no tax on tips will become law, I mean, we are really down. We went from, sports betting possibilities and possible election outcomes and issues like that down to the most absurd thing you can think of. And lo and behold, as I say that, Kalshi's partnering with a guy who just came out and said it and said, Kalshi allows me to bet on stupid things. So I don't know how any of this falls under the Commodities Futures and Trading Commission. And we're kind of in the theater of the absurd part of the whole issue quickly, which I didn't expect to get until we were way down further in litigation or possibly.
Kafkaesque is a very
Yeah,
good word, Jason. I think that's one of the best descriptive words we've used so
right.
far. I think Kafkaesque is the one.
We raised this issue with the Senate Indian Affairs Committee today, where there's a number of people on the Agricultural Committee, and also Senator Cortez Masto, who's from Nevada. Her staff was there. They came right over and jumped on us, and we gave them a lot of the talking points and issue papers that the CFTC tribal group has been passing around, and they were very appreciative of it. And of course, Dina Titus, the congresswoman from Nevada, is been sending letters, and we always attach her letters as part of what we're sending around the Hill. So, we've started this blitz. It was interesting. The one comment I'll share is, in the Iowa folks, they immediately asked, what is the Iowa Gaming Commission? What is the Iowa agricultural folks saying about this? And we said, well, we have not alerted them yet. They're our next on our target. So this is because Iowa does have sports betting, and immediately they said, well, how would this impact state revenue? Well, exactly. So very, once people understand this, it starts to become, like you said, they understand the absurdity of it, and whether or not this is good public policy should actually be debated, and not trying to be decided in a district court by, frankly, some judges who gave it scant analysis and just punted on it until a later date. So uh, I tell you what, though, the frightening thing for our guests and also the listeners, I heard about that no tax on tips futures contract from just a buddy of mine who said his son in college had bet on it, and he didn't know I'm involved in any of this stuff. And I immediately I called him because he texted. I said, "Who did he bet this through?" And he said Kalshi. And right then I knew. I was like, "Oh man, if the college kids are already getting in on this, it's going to explode like wildfire." Because we've already seen this happen with so-called free,
DFS,
yes, free gaming, daily fantasy sports, sweepstakes.
sweepstakes. Yep.
Yeah, these kids are very savvy on this, and if they see stuff, they just see the world differently. I can tell you that. And some of the younger staffers were around, have other stories about what people are betting on out there, and it's all through your phone, and it's all under our noses, and a lot of regulators don't even know that it's going on. So the challenge is out there, and I'm glad we have this great lineup today to update us on where we go next.
You know what? Let's start with Brian. You know what I mean, gentlemen. First of all, welcome again. But Brian, you wrote an op-ed last week. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, thanks, Victor, and I'm glad to be here with Scott and Joe, two guys I really respect and have worked with over the years and know their stuff. Uh, yeah, I was just trying to get folks' attention on this because I think it is an important issue uh, and a big threat and challenge to the tribal gaming industry. I think it's important to understand, straight away that these futures markets or events contracts, when you get into the academic theory of them, there are good reasons to have these because you're able to not only hedge your investment risk, but it gets us the ability to predict things that are important to the economy. And at its core, investing in the stock market or anything like a futures market looks a lot like gambling. And we've made these distinctions, between what we value for economic purposes and what we value for entertainment. And when it falls on the entertainment side of the ledger, we typically view that as gambling, and that's what tribes have been using to support our communities for, almost, my entire lifetime now. And so, if you can morph this other thing that is supposed to be used for an economic purpose and turn it into entertainment gambling and self-certify, which is something Kalshi was allowed to do, is to basically say, yeah, we're complying with the law. We don't need any permission. And all of a sudden they can offer sports betting to every 18-year-old in the entire country, including on the reservation. That is a huge market advantage. And it's a huge threat to the Indian gaming industry. And it goes far beyond what was ever intended with futures trading and in these prediction markets. And so I think I wrote that op-ed as a way to shine a light on this and also to try to make sure folks were redirecting that light onto other agencies like the National Indian Gaming Commission that need to have a say in all of this. Before I cede the microphone here, it's important to note that these futures contracts and this whole system is regulated by the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And as I said, you can self-certify that you're complying with the law and just start offering these contracts. They did a proposed rule last year while I was still serving in government to try to define gaming because gaming is prohibited for futures contracts. That rule was never shared with the Department of the Interior, wasn't shared with the National Indian Gaming Commission that I'm aware of. Folks in the government who have expertise on gaming weren't a part of that discussion. And if you look at the proposed rule itself, there's a lot of talk about gaming as defined by state law and no mention of IGRA or the relevance to tribes. And so I think it's important that Indian country be aware of this, and that we're also speaking to not only members of Congress and policymakers, but the agencies that regulate Indian gaming.
What do we think, Jason? Well, you know what? I think one of the big issues here, as you write this, we're looking at an administration even that has changed. You know what I mean? If you look at what the Biden administration was doing, they're saying, no, we oppose this. We think we should take a deeper look at this. Now you have the Trump administration with they dropped their appeal. You know what I mean? Against Kalshi. So now you have the government just saying we don't want any part of this. So where does that leave us? Scott, Joe?
Yeah, let's hear from the litigators, who are following these cases. If you want to start out, Scott, go ahead.
Well, the point of the abandonment of this administration, is correct. This is if the CFTC looked like it was taking on the responsible tack and told Kalshi they couldn't go forward with the betting on elections, which was the first case that they well, secured a victory at the trial court, saying betting on an election isn't gaming in the district court. It's, I mean, sometimes it's great from a litigator point of view to throw their own words at them. They distinguished betting on elections from betting on sports as why elections wasn't gaming. And then, as soon as the ink was dry on the opinion, they self-certified their ability to offer prediction markets on sports betting. And now, Brian's as Victor said, they're on a roll. They've, the district, as soon as Nevada and New Jersey and Maryland issued cease and desist letters, Kalshi turned around and sued them. And we now have two federal district court orders denying Nevada and New Jersey's motions for temporary restraining orders, and we know that the New Jersey case is now up on appeal. But as Victor pointed out, the administration had appealed, the Biden administration had appealed the decision on elections, and that was actually fully briefed and had been argued at the Court of Appeals. And the Trump administration comes along and says, "Oh no, let's just drop that appeal." So if you're keeping score on a litigator point of view, they're on a roll. But these issues still come down to your point is, well, what changed? We now, the general counsel from CFTC is gone, the director is gone, the interim director was a commissioner who had already made comments suggesting that she likes things like Kalshi offering betting on anything and everything, including sports betting, and Trump's nominee to become the permanent director, I think his role as the CEO is one of the heads of Kalshi, and of course
Legal
Kalshi
counsel. Yeah.
turns around And I think it's Donald Trump Jr. that is sitting on the board of directors or a policy advisor to the Kalshi board. It's clear that this falls into that genre of we don't care what the rules are, we don't care what the law says, we're just going to do it anyway. And when you have this self-certification, where companies like Kalshi, once they're properly registered, it's not like, okay, CFTC, here's what we're going to do. Tell us that it's legal. It's no, we're going to self-certify our decision and make that call for ourselves. And that's really put, the litigators, I mean, we, basically, not just tribal gaming interests, but state gaming interests. And I mean every state gaming interest, including states like Utah and Hawaii, where they have no gaming. They have to wake up and understand that this takes, really 200 years of jurisprudence of how sovereign entities within the United States make that determination on the policy calls of what are we going to do for gaming? Is it just going to be a lottery? Is it going to be lottery and brick and mortar? Are we going to allow online betting? How are we going to regulate it? How are we going to make sure that people are of age when they're doing it? This complex, rich body of laws that really, when you look at the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act and it talked about the balancing of those interests, it really was referring to that 200 years of jurisprudence where each of these different sovereign entities has decided within itself how it's going to go about dealing with gaming. And this tactic and what Kalshi, the legal argument that Kalshi has prevailed upon, takes all of that and just bulldozes it to the side of the road and says, okay, in this new vacuum of quote preemptive federal law without any set of regulatory structure or infusion of responsible gaming. I mean, as we pointed out, 18-year-olds, can make a bet on Kalshi, where almost every state that allows gambling at all requires them to be 21. It takes both tribal sovereignty and state sovereignty and says to heck with it, even though the underlying statute says you can't have prediction markets on gaming. Clearly, sports betting is gaming. We've got to figure out a way to get a court to look into the core merits of that issue and bring it into this because this is an existential threat, folks. We're not being alarmist. This is a development that, if they succeed, will completely wipe out any state or tribal sovereign authority over mobile gaming on your lands.
Well, and Victor, if I can jump in here, and Joe, sorry, I'll be quick, I promise. Scott mentioned that Kalshi is on a roll in the courts, and that's true. One of the reasons why they've been successful in their three court opinions so far is that the courts have said federal law preempts state gambling law. So Congress passed this Commodities Exchange Act, and that preempts any state gambling law. Well, as I noted in my column, which is the link here is here in the chat, IGRA also preempts state law. And so, this is a tool that tribes have in their tool chest at the moment, is that we're not subject to those same preemption arguments that Kalshi has been making against these state lawsuits. And that's an area where tribes can get engaged in this fight, and Kalshi will have to come up with completely different arguments. And we'll be able to get to the merits about whether what they're actually doing is gaming or not.
Yeah.
You could talk to that, Joe. Where's the intersection for tribal sovereignty, tribal interests on this, and how can tribes get into court on them? Because remember, Kalshi sued Nevada and New Jersey. They went after them, in response to the Gaming Commission's cease and desist order. So where's the tribal intersection here, Joe?
Sure. Well, Jason, I think it's important to note that at this point, Indian country has not been heard from in any of the litigation. You've got 4 federal cases that are pending, 3 that were brought by Kalshi, 1 that's been brought by crypto.com. None of those cases involve a Indian tribe as a party or as an amicus. So any arguments about IGRA have been brought by non-tribal parties, and that frankly has been slow. But it's starting to at least be recognized that IGRA is an issue. But to that point, I thought it was really telling looking at the Kalshi brief that was filed recently in Nevada, where they're very blunt about the stakes here. And what they say IGRA's definition of gaming does not extend to sports event contracts. But even if it did, the CEA's exclusive jurisdiction provision would displace any attempt by tribes to regulate those contracts. Rather, if the CFTC has jurisdiction, its power is exclusive. I mean, think about that. I mean, they're essentially saying that Congress, in passing the CEA, has displaced any role for tribes and tribal regulators in what I think is clear to everybody is a gaming activity. So the fact that these arguments really haven't been made, at least not in detail, I think is a concern. But at the same time, I'll also say, these are early innings right now. And yes, Kalshi's had a couple of early wins, but we're very early in terms of the litigation route. I mean, these are orders on motions for preliminary relief. We really haven't had these fully briefed. Certainly there hasn't been any appellate decision on this. I think as Scott noted, there's one appeal now of an order that's gone to the Third Circuit. That'll take some time to sort out, but ultimately, I do think that the tribes need to be involved, and there's different ways to be involved. Certainly, as amicus is one route, but I also think that there certainly are possibilities for tribes to get more directly involved to attempt to intervene in some of these cases, because tribal interests are absolutely at stake, particularly in jurisdictions where tribes are located, where tribes have compacts for sports betting. So I think that's another route. I mean, there's following up on what Scott said, the CFTC's own regulations already say that you cannot have contracts that involve gaming. I mean, the policy decision's already been made. So I think it's some of the decisions so far, I don't think they've really focused so much on that, as opposed to suggesting, well, it's ultimately up to the CFTC to decide. Well, I guess my position is CFTC already did decide it. They decided you can't do it. There hasn't been any enforcement, but that doesn't change what the regulation says. In addition to IGRA, the other statute that frankly really hasn't been briefed a lot until recently is the Wire Act, which prohibits interstate sports betting or transmission of information with respect to sports betting. And the Wire Act, until really quite recently, was more of a footnote than a central argument. I think if you look at the brief that Maryland just filed, Maryland really, I think, has done the most comprehensive job so far in terms of laying out these arguments, both the textual argument about the CEA, but also these other statutes, including the Wire Act and IGRA. So, Jason, to your question, I think tribes absolutely should be involved because the federal law with respect to tribes is something that is not preempted by the CEA, and it's important to explain what that means.
Victor and Joe, Dev was absolutely right. Victor and Jason, one of the things that people who aren't lawyers hate about us lawyers is that we can sit here and tell you that up isn't up and down isn't down, and right doesn't actually mean right. And Kalshi's arguments, are just the classic embodiment of all this. That what you're seeing, it's very much like a Jedi mind trick. This is not the gaming you're looking for. And the DC District Court kind of fell for that a little bit when it said, well, the statute says gaming, but there's no real definition to gaming. And all of us I've gathered here understand that there is. And at its core, the question, when you strip away all the lawyers and all the Jedi mind tricks, what's really the question at the heart of this is Kalshi offering internet sports betting? And they tell you that they are. That's what they're advertising on their Instagram page right now, nationwide sports betting. And it's either sports betting or it's not. And if it is sports betting, IGRA says you can't do that on our lands unless we, as tribes, allow it. And if it's not sports betting, then why the hell are all of us running around trying to get licenses and compacts and approvals to do this stuff if the federal government is telling us that's not actually gaming? So if it's gaming, they're violating tribal laws, they're violating IGRA, they're gambling outside of what's allowed in a compact. And if it's not gaming, then why are we following IGRA at all to offer Class 3 sports betting on tribal lands? That's at the core of this whole thing.
I don't know how much problem it's causing with reading.
Well, but it also, one of the big issue that I'm hearing from the industry and that I hear, and I'm reading and I'm processing is that it's also an erosion of the tax base. So it goes against state sovereignty too. And it feels like the states are just rolling over, or like you said, this is the early battle right now. But I think you're looking at a market that wants the states and everybody to capitulate when we've just started. You know what I mean? We're going to take this, but yeah, I mean, you have to admire the chutzpah. I mean, they're almost tribal in their chutzpah. You know what I mean? Which is, we're going to sue them, we're going to do it. So you have to admire the fact that these guys aren't backing down. But I think the bigger issue here for me is, what does this mean for tribal exclusivity? What does this mean for Florida? What does this mean for the amount of money the tribes just made a compact with? And I know, Joe, you're probably going to have to deal with this, so you probably don't want to answer it. But later on down the road, you're spending billions of dollars for the state of Florida just to have your exclusivity eroded. That's kind of what we're looking at, isn't it, Scott, Brian? Again, Joe, I know you're probably going to have to deal with that one, but that's kind of what we're looking at, right?
Well, to Joe's point, we're in the early innings. Kalshi, has got some, tremendous victories. But they're early. They're at the temporary restraining order stage, I think a big part of this issue is just how incredibly fast. I mean, was following this as the election betting being a quirk thing last fall, and now it's just blown up into this, huge industry that truly is an existential threat. That, to your point, to your question, Victor, um, uh, you know, you know, you know, you know, if everybody, if all the operators and people are going to prediction markets, and in this environment, and that federal preemption argument, well, that means, as I said earlier, state law and state rules and tribal state compacts, are all bulldozered over to the side. They're not going to be taxed, because they're, quote, not sports betting. So it does have. I mean, we have strange bedfellows in fighting this issue, but one of them is the states themselves, because IGRA makes it clear that they can't do this as a matter of federal law, but it also means that states like Texas and Utah and Hawaii that have said, we don't want anything to do with mobile gaming. Their sovereign authority to make that decision is gone if Kalshi, wins these decisions. But I think that this is one of those issues to where the more sunshine, the more brightness of day that is shined upon it, where people, wake up and realize what's going on, you're going to see more and more people, rise up against this. Fortunately, even though they lost, and we, as tribal lawyers, we feel that, there's a lot of arguments they left on the table in their briefing. But at least Nevada and New Jersey, have stood up. And now you're seeing, I think, a discussion starting to occur amongst state regulators and state attorney generals and state legislators, understanding, that this issue is an existential threat to them as well. And when you look at, the things I talked about earlier about how, the Trump administration is basically, displace the responsible people out of the CFTC and bringing in people who, are, predisposed to give Kalshi the green light. The more brightness of day that's put on that, the more likely we are to start seeing, court decisions and public opinion and legislators weighing in, to bring this thing to an end. But we have to win. I mean, this is one of those, I've been involved in tribal gaming, since before IGRA, and and I don't know if I've ever seen such an existential threat progress so rapidly, where I admit we're playing catch up, figuring out, how to, weigh in on a train that's already left the station with some key victories in Kalshi's pocket.
Yeah, to the point about speed, kind of looking at when this came about, this was right before Christmas. So we're less than 5 months since this issue really broke as publicly in terms of what they were planning to offer and the realization that this was in fact something that, sure looks like sports betting. And to Jason's point, in terms of people, only hearing about it the first time, I think that has been one of the problems is right now, certainly those of us that are involved in this on a day-to-day basis, we're, living and breathing this, but there's a lot of folks out in the public and certainly in Indian country as well who really haven't heard a lot about this issue or maybe gotten the details in terms of what this actually means. Because I agree with Scott. I mean, this is an existential threat to tribal gaming. If this is allowed to proceed unchecked, it really undermines the whole structure that I think everybody thought we were operating under.
It feels like as a Native American, we hear from our ancestors and we read in the books that, they had the land, they hunted, but then the rules changed, the laws changed, the laws of the lands changed right underneath their feet. This feels like the same thing. You know what I mean? The rules of the lands are changing. The rules that we thought we were playing by are completely changing, and with an administration that seems willing to just let it go. So I think the rules of engagement are different than this one than the other. You know what I mean? Go ahead, Jason. Sorry.
The nominee, this Brian Quintens, he has statements in the past where he thinks the whole CEA in some form or manner is unconstitutional, and he was going to allow these sports betting contracts to move forward back in 2020 when another company was proposing having NFL futures contracts. And, with very little analysis, he just said, when we think of commodities, we think of oil, gold, and agricultural products. And then he just says, but you know what? Other things are commodities too, such as any kind of event with an outcome. And and that's kind of way some of these judges, they just arrived at a conclusion by just stating what they believed and with no real analysis. And I just, so that's who our new commissioner at the CFTC will probably be. I mean, we're going to have the agricultural committee, ask them as much as we can about this, but it's, like you said, it's kind of being baked into the pie at this point, and we are behind. But you know, the more we can shine the light on some of the absurdity of this, you know, I just don't think it survives scrutiny, but it might take some time. Um, I was a little more pessimistic about Congress moving on this anytime soon, but I'm telling you, once they hear about it, they almost do a double take and say, "Well, that's not
Mhm.
what the CFTC was ever meant for." So, uh, maybe we'll get some action, or, even if it's just appropriations language where, the CFTC cannot, appropriate money you know, in carrying out or allowing these futures contracts, something to that effect to sort of stunt it for a little while till we can clear it up a little more.
But understand the structure of this thing and what we're really up against is this is you know I mean we've seen the appropriation game work both for us and against us over
That's
the
true,
years,
Scott.
where he's saying you can't spend money to do certain things. But the way they have set this up with the self-certification, saying, okay, CFTC, you can't spend any money to do these things. We got to be careful there because that could actually play right into Kalshi's hands. Because Kalshi's argument is, unless the CFTC tells us we can't do this, then we can,
Yep.
and that's a problem. Where's
Like
where's the final agency action for us to sue the CFTC?
I
Well, you
think
know what, Scott,
so.
but you know what, it just, and jumping through everything, it just seems like this is going to go to the Supreme Court. I was laying in bed and with my little non-legal brain, and that was the thing that popped out into my head. It's like, there's no other way for this to go, because if Congress is gonna not do its duty, then you have to go. And I feel like it's going to be like the pornography thing. You know what I mean? Where
So,
if it looks like pornography, then it is, or whatever. You know what I mean? If it looks like
Go
gambling, then it is
go
gambling.
ahead, Brian. Yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
I was gonna say, at first I want to co-sign, you know, Joe and Scott about this being an existential threat to tribal gaming. Because they'll essentially be able to replicate the gaming market nationally without any permission structure, and they can do it. And because there's no permission structure, they can move quickly. Now, so far it's been states who've been trying to carry the water here, and as I mentioned, they've lost some rulings on some of the preemption arguments, but nobody is going to be able to defend the tribal gaming industry from outside of Indian country. It's going to take Indian country making those arguments. And while it is in the early innings, the more decisions Kalshi racks up in its favor, and the more you get opinions like in the DC District Court that say, well, gaming isn't really gaming unless it involves gambling on a game. But the more we have to contend with those arguments when we finally decide to bring our challenges. And so waiting comes with a lot of opportunity costs for Indian country. And the other thing I'll just add here is, again, there's a lot of talk about the CFTC and not enough talk about the NIGC,
Right.
which regulates gaming or regulates nominally gaming uh, under IGRA. And the NIGC, way back in 2001, when Kevin Washburn was the general counsel there, issued an opinion that said sports betting is class 3 gaming. And that is binding on the NIGC right now. And that's the state of the law right now. And so it comes back to the question of, is Kalshi, by offering nationwide sports betting, are they conducting class 3 gaming on Indian lands? And if they are, the only people who can step in and make the case that that's a violation of our interests is us in Indian country. And so the longer folks wait to get engaged, the higher the opportunity costs will be.
Yeah.
One of the
Go
one
ahead,
of the
Scott.
strategies that that is worth putting, and I'm sure Kalshi's listening to this podcast.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
Is
Hi,
you know
Trick.
it is kind of is basically bring it on. I mean, they have responded to cease and desist orders by state gaming regulators by filing lawsuits against them. Well, there's several hundred tribal gaming regulatory agencies that have the authority over gaming activity over that tribe's Indian lands, and perhaps the tribes need to submit their own cease and desist orders and say Kalshi, please sue us. Here's the address of the courthouse.
I mean, Joe, we don't, I mean, if it gets to the Supreme Court, something's gone terribly wrong, correct? I mean, at that point, I mean,
We
with
got to be prepared
I don't
for
know
it.
about, I mean, I think that this probably will go to the Supreme Court at some point. Just because of the interest at stake. And yeah, would, there will be more litigation. I mean, we haven't seen what Maryland's going to do yet. There's probably going to be other litigation as well. And so I think at some point you're going to get some conflicting decisions, and the court's is going to be the appropriate place to resolve that. But it's short of that. I don't see any other action unless there is something from Congress, that's going to put an immediate stop to what's going on right now.
yeah,
I've given this a lot of thought, and and if you listen to what Kalshi and Tariq are saying, they're saying, listen, um, the balm they're trying to give everyone is just saying, listen, this isn't you're doing prediction markets. It's an event contract. You know what I mean? It isn't gambling. You are saying this is going to happen at a certain time and in a certain event and stuff like that. And they saying, we can't do parlays and stuff like that at this time because to write a contract. But you know what? I think it's just a matter of time when this stuff is just sped up. Once they get permission through Congress that you can get regulations that are done at light speed, then you can speed this thing up, just like you do with class two, just like what you do it with sweepstakes gambling or historical racing. It's not gambling, it's something else. You know what I mean? And I think that's where this is going. Once they speed up the regulatory part of this, then you'll be able to do contracts in an instant. And that's where this is going, where these contracts are going to be done in an instant, just like when you press a button and the random number generator. Instead, it's going to be a contract. That's where this is going.
But
what about that, Joe?
And I think maybe Scott made the point that they're advertising right now that they are doing gambling. They're advertising it as sports betting. So it's on the one hand they're saying that it's something different, but when they're marketing it, they're making the argument that it's the same, basically the same as sports betting.
So what's going to happen? You're going to be saying, "I'm not gambling, I'm contracting," right? Is
Right.
that what's going to happen? That's what's happening, right?
It's not the ground, it's the floor. It's not
I'm
the
a
Earth, it's
contractor.
the third planet from the sun. Yeah, no, one of the things that we need to, that makes me a little bit nervous about this is in terms of looking at our bedfellows, is right now, the regulated sports betting operators, DraftKings, FanDuel, Caesars, BetMGM, they're looking at this and saying, well, we're not going to, we've invested this, we made this enormous investment into the regulated sports betting environment, and we're not going to put our existing licenses at stake by jumping into this market. So that's created an opportunity for Kalshi, to start creating its own market share by basically being first to market. But do understand that if Kalshi prevails and you now have a clear legal path, to offer sports betting in this way, DraftKings, FanDuel's, all the major operators will just simply abandon what they've done and go into this prediction market environment where there's no taxation, there's no regulatory structure, and as you pointed out, Victor, they're just going to work their technologies, parlays, are under their own theory, if one of the parlay bettings is a prediction market contract and you add a second one and you add a third one, that parlay is a prediction market contract. They're just going to speed it up and offer it. It's disingenuous for, I think FanDuel's is the one that put it out there and said, well, we really can't do parlays as a prediction market model, so we'd rather do it, the way we're doing it in these regulated environments. That's nonsense. That's misdirection from what's real at stake. Don't think for a moment that, oh, I mean, we had this own argument regarding class two gaming in Indian country, right? Oh, it's clunky, it's slow, people prefer this other product.
Right.
Once you get the designers saying, give me the rules that I got to work by, they're going to provide a product that provides the same experience to the sports bettor that the parlay options currently offer.
So Scott, do you remember the dot button?
I do.
So that's what we're talking here. It's going to be like a dot button.
No,
right?
It has to be slow. Right?
It's going to be a dot button. And for those that remember, is that when we first started doing class two in the bingo, they're like initially they're going, we're going to put a dot button on there. So like a bingo machine, it's going to so you would press a button and it would spin, and then you'd hit another button that had a dot button, and then you would stop it, and that was kind of like the process of gambling. And then at some point it was just like, get rid of it, and the gameplay is the same thing. And so my point is eventually the gameplay gets sped up through technology and through stuff like that. And so I think that's what a lot of people like myself and other people in the industry are just
to your point, Brian, about the stakeholders, they haven't heard from Indian country yet. In my discussions on the Senate side today, especially with the Nevada folks, they looked at me and they said, well, we haven't heard anything about this from from commercial gaming. And I don't know how to explain that. I'm just flabbergasted. And they haven't heard. They go, well, we need to check with the AGA, American Gaming. And I know AGA is at least nominally against this. They were going to come to the roundtable today and speak out about it, but they haven't been, out there publicly or even lobbying wise out there. And then the third element is the sports leagues and college sports. I just don't know how they're going to tolerate this. It's just ripe for corruption, and we've already got corruption, with the Alabama baseball coach was betting on his own team in Ohio. But then again, Scott, in this crazy world, they just reinstated Pete Rose. They even reinstated Shoeless Joe Jackson, someone told me.
Well, Jason, even more than that, the NCAA is talking about getting rid of the rule for players to gamble. That's too restrictive and looking at other alternatives. So the softening of gambling is happening.
So
what I mean?
Victor and Jason, Scott alluded to this too, that some of these other folks in the industry, are watching. They'll follow the easiest path to the money. And so if there's a path to do nationwide sports betting by calling your product a futures, an events contract, they're not going to do the state by state and tribe by tribe slog to get into the industry. And so you look at places like Michigan, where we did build a statewide internet gaming and sports betting market with tribes and commercial operators and partners. Tribes invested a lot in those partnerships. We did when I was president at Bay Mills in our partnership with DraftKings. And there are tribes that are partnering with a lot of these operators, in other places for on-premises or other different types of sports betting. And then, of course, tribes have to, in places like Florida, build these into their compacts. Tribes have invested a lot in the iGaming industry already in a lot of these partnerships. And one of the questions that's hanging out there, looming over this, is why would those partners, what incentives do those partners have to stay in those partnerships if they can go to this nationwide market, they self-certify, they don't pay state-by-state licensing fees and taxes and split their earnings with tribal partners and states? Why wouldn't they do that? And I think that's why you're not seeing a real aggressive stance by the AGA because they want to go to the easiest path to the money. And if Kalshi wins here, they don't care if it's a new way to make the money; they'll go that way. And so it's once again, it's really going to be on us as Indian country to defend our own interests here. And I think if folks are hoping that some of these states are going to carry our water and win the day for us, you know, that's a big risk to take with the industry that has supported, so many of our tribes for the last 40 years. And, for a long time, people saw off-track betting and horse racing, that was the show in the gaming industry. And look where it is now, because the industry passed them by. And so this thing's moving fast and things can change. The ground can change under your feet. And I think it's important for Indian country to be at the table with Congress, to be at the table with regulators, and to be in the courts defending our interests because nobody else is going to do it for us.
All right.
Jason, what did we learn today, brother?
Yeah, I mean, real quick, a lot of good comments and questions on here.
Yeah.
We touched on whether, we can start to have a slot machine looking device. I think we all agree probably at some point just to make this whole thing move faster. Questions about personal jurisdiction over Kalshi and, and whether these companies start offering prediction markets in California. Joe, you want to talk about that? I mean,
Well,
it's already all over the country. I mean, if you're in California, you can do this already.
That's right. They're operating in all 50 states right now. It's not something that's coming, it's here. And so the question is how it's going to evolve, but they are up and running. And I think, we're looking at just a couple of companies so far, but, I do think it's, that's just the start.
So personal jurisdiction, that's anywhere where a citizen might be.
Yeah, I think in terms of being able to get into court, I think the fact that they're operating all these different jurisdictions, that's unlikely to be a problem.
Yeah, right.
Well, you know what, guys, and I'm in conversation right now with Alex Kane from Sports Trade, and I hope to have him on next week. And I've invited Tariq Mansour and Sarah Slane on, and I told him that we were going to be doing this, and I believe they're on right now, and I'd like to have them on next week because I'd like to hear the other side too. You know what I mean? But from where I stand right now, it's just, those federal laws were created for the good of society, you know what I mean? And trading and commodities and, things like national highways and stuff like that. And this is not that. This is not for the good of society. This is not. So I think we're still in the very, obviously we're in the very beginning innings of this thing and we have a ways to go. But I think it starts with us having an awareness of the situation and making sure other tribes and other, everyone understands the situation. I think with Jason going on the Hill and hearing them not really understanding the situation is terrifying and unsurprising, you know?
Well, I mean, and to Scott's point about he said as a litigator, he loved to use people's own words against him. Look at this agreement that Kalshi's advertising with so-called Club Pro guy, who basically just lays it out there for everybody that, Kalshi allows him to bet on stupid things was his exact quote. And, he's some TikTok or social media influencer type guy. And the company they're starting to keep, it's not really going to pass much of the smell test, especially as an academic exercise. Because if their whole model was, well, the UK allows this kind of stuff, that's a different animal than just allowing what's starting to go on here, where we're betting on whether the Alaska volcano is going to erupt by July 1st. I just don't know what hedging that would have. I don't know what public policy use that has. It's stupid, right? and their own advertising now is calling what they do stupid. So it's unbelievable. If you just look up Club Pro Guy, you'll see it. Victor, is it on your website yet, Victor, that
Oh
article?
yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah,
That's what it
if
came. Oh yeah.
I wish I had better command of my hard drive here and give you the actual quote. But when Robinhood, started offering this product, they put out a Q&A fact sheet on their webpage, and it actually, to try to make this sound like, it's no different than, betting against whether there's going to be a freeze that kills the carrots in Florida. It actually points out that encourages sports franchises to use the prediction markets to bet against their own teams.
Right. Yeah. I think everyone
Yeah,
everyone's
So you can see
it's
this
their own words.
makes sense, right?
where you had, the 76ers tanking for years, trusting the process, trying to get, I mean, at some point, and enough people nowadays just want to believe any kind of conspiracy theory, whether it's election conspiracy theory, vaccine conspiracy theory. People, their brands will be damaged from this, because if some crazy ending at a game happens, and then they look on the prediction markets and X amount of people had that outcome, their brand is not going to survive that. It's just crazy that, they're going to reinstate Shoeless Joe Jackson, who tried to fix a game. Pete Rose, all he did was, claims all he did was bet on his own team and was trying to make, I guess, positive bets. But
Right.
Shoeless Joe Jackson, they were actively throwing the World Series. People will believe that this can happen, and no one will watch your product anymore.
Well, and it's much
great.
more vulnerable in this
Yeah.
context. I mean, I know we're running out of time, but part of the discussion has got to be, completely separate and apart from the legal point of view, is, the CFTC does not have the regulatory infrastructure, to regulate a national sports wagering industry. There's no licensing structure, no suitability standard, no set of rules and regulations as it impacts age and problem gambling I mean, to your point, Jason, already with this burgeoning sports betting industry in a regulated environment, we're dealing in situations where, young college kids are being threatened to blow points, and it'd be one thing, when you're, the what, the you know, early 19th century White Sox, cheating as a whole team. It's another thing when you can influence one player, to, don't you dare go over that 20 point, threshold in today's game, and plays right into these parlay bets. I mean, we've got the problem with those issues, or the answer to those issues, is that regulation allows you to pull out those illegal bets. But what Kalshi is looking to do here is get into a situation to where they overtake the industry without any of that regulatory and structure, to make sure that the games stay fair and honest. And that's got to be part of this discussion as well. The CFTC doesn't have the capacity to do what a myriad of state and tribal regulatory agencies are responsible for doing.
Well, you know what, gentlemen, we're at the end of our time. This issue is just so much more complex in 1 hour. And also having your 4 brilliant minds, including Jason, is, it's really unfair to the clock, because you guys are brilliant. And so, like, we have so much more to talk about this. Again, we're just in the very beginning of it. I want to thank you all for coming. Jason, you want to wrap it up, my friend?
No, well, I mean, we're going to hopefully continue this on into next week.
Well,
And then,
we'll be talking about it at mid-year in
Right.
Minnesota.
but
I'm
NCAI mid-year too, in June at Foxwoods. Foxwoods has got a deal with, I think it's FanDuel or DraftKings. One of them runs their sports book there.
DraftKings.
Yeah, so we'll be, at Foxwoods in June, and carry on this conversation at our gaming subcommittee there. So Indian country's, I think, better tuned into it now. I made that.
Portland, for the Northwestern
Right.
or Washington.
Right. I made this CFTC presentation at the Indian Affairs Committee, and there were packed tribal leaders there and everybody. So at least they're starting to hear more about it. So we're moving forward, but I'm with Scott, Joe, and Brian. Existential threat is thrown around too much, but this is it. This one is is the end game right here. So
What a year.
yeah.
So, gentlemen, thank you very much. I really appreciate you all very, very much. As soon as I invited you, all said yes instantly. So, I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much, Jason, and for all the everyone out there. We appreciate you guys again. We'll see you next week, and we're going to hear the other side next week. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Victor.
Thank you.
Thanks, Victor. Thank you.